pleasure to introduce our speaker. Professor Robert Hartsuiker is a professor of psychology at the Department of Experimental Psychology, Ghent University in Belgium. He's an experimental psychologist studying language processing, and he's interested in language production, bilingualism, self-monitoring of speech, as well as in cognitive aspects of the use of English as a medium of instruction in higher education. Over the years, his work has addressed research questions in these domains using a wide range of methods, including behavioral experiments, eye tracking, EEG, fMRI, computational models, and the study of language processing in individuals with brain damage. Between 2006 and 2014, Professor Hartsuiker was the head of the Department of Experimental Psychology. He's also worked as an associate editor for Acta Psychologica and Psychological Science, and he was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cognitive Psychology. And today, Professor Hartsuiker will deliver a lecture on syntactic blocking when syntactic representations are not shared across languages. So now this virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And let me just start by sharing my screen. Let's see if we can do so. Okay. Okay. Can you see the screen and hear my voice well? Okay, great. Yeah. Then, yeah, it would have been so nice to be with you physically today in Poznan. I've seen the pictures of your lovely building. I just wanted to show you that in Ghent we also have a lovely building, but I still really would have liked to see yours as well. So thanks for the kind introduction again. As you said, I'm a psycholinguist by training, and I'm particularly interested in the psycholinguistics of bilingualism and second language learning, and that will be the topic of my keynote today. So let's dive in there right away with the observation that if we look at the different languages that a bilingual might know, that one is confronted with syntactic rules that are often, but not always, similar across languages. And we see a few examples in the green frame here. So if we look at passives, for instance, in English and in Dutch, then we have a passive in Dutch that's quite similar to the one in English, namely ones that end in the by phrase. The clown is tickled by the waiter, or the Dutch translation. De clown wordt gekieteld door de ober. Interestingly enough, Dutch has a word order variant in which the prepositional phrase is medial and the participle verb comes at the end. So in this case, we have a rule that's somewhat different between Dutch and English. If we look at datives, we see that the dative alternation is quite similar in Dutch and English. Both languages have a double object or DO dative, such as the clown shows the waiter a book. And both languages have a prepositional object dative or a PO dative, such as the clown shows a book to the waiter. Now, the question that's been fascinating me for quite a long time is whether late bilinguals have shared representations for these structures that are similar among their languages. And if they do, such shared representations might be a vehicle for cross-language influences. One language would be able easily to influence the other language because they share some of their representation of sentence form. Now, of course, that requires, in a sense, that the languages of bilinguals or multilinguals more generally interact with each other. And in fact, there is really a plethora of evidence for this if we look at the lexical level. So there are many studies showing language co-activation in bilinguals during the production and comprehension of words. Examples are the cognate effect in written or spoken word recognition. False friends, on the other hand, are recognized more slowly than control words. There's eye movement studies showing that if, for instance, Russian-English bilinguals hear an instruction in Russian to look at a stamp, a marku, they spuriously look at a marker that happens to be in the environment. And I don't know what the Russian word for marker is, but it's a different word from marku. So they must have activated the English lexicon while hearing a Russian word. So given all this language co-activation, why not influences at the level of the sentence structure? And on the left side of the slide, you see just a little joke, a side of Dutchisms, showing an example of how a Dutch construction, where subject and verb are inverted in a question, where they transfer this, as it were, to English. This is just a joke side, but of course, such effects happen also in real life. And the question is whether such shared representations might be a vehicle for influences at the level of syntax. But how do we study this sort of questions? Well, in much of my research, we've used the so-called syntactic priming paradigm, or the structural priming paradigm, as a tool, a methodological tool, to study syntactic influences across languages. And there are many guises in which this paradigm appears. One example is the sort of paradigm you see on the left side of the slide, where you have a person, so a participant, looking at pictures, for instance, this picture here, together with a sentence. The man is reading a book to the baby, and the task is simply to do picture-sentence matching. So is this a correct description of the picture? The answer is yes. In this case, they push the button and then go on to the next trial, which is a picture description trial. So they are presented with a picture and they describe it with a single sentence. And in this case, they might, for instance, describe the picture with the child is handing an apple to the teacher, or they might describe it with the child is handing the teacher an apple. So as you can see in the target picture, the participant has the option to choose a prepositional object sentence like the one you see on the slide, or a double object or DO sentence like the one that would be the child is handing the teacher an apple. And then in the prime sentence, we can of course manipulate the structure that the participant is exposed to. In this example, a PO, but it could also have been a DO in another condition. And syntactic priming happens to the extent that a PO response is more likely after a PO prime than after a DO prime. And this is exactly what Bach found in 1986, already, as you see on the slide over here. This is the percentage of PO datives, and this percentage is higher given a PO prime than after a DO prime. Bach also presented active and passive prime sentences and had people describe transitive events with actives or passives, and found that passive responses were more frequent after a passive prime than after an active prime. So also priming at the level of actives and passives. Okay, that was 1986. In the subsequent decades, there have been many studies replicating the basic syntactic priming effect in many different sentence structures, experimental paradigms, also in different populations, in patients with neuropsychological damage, in children, in people who stutter, and also in a range of different languages. And Mahawald et al. In 2016, so there's an error on this slide, did a meta-analysis of many of those studies and showed that the structural priming effect is quite a robust phenomenon. It's really there. And that one major modulator of this effect is lexical overlap, between the prime and the target. So priming is stronger when, in the example you see over here, we would use the verb to read both in the prime and in the target sentence. Then you get stronger priming than in this example here, where you have a different verb. Nevertheless, there is strong priming as well in conditions without lexical overlap. So it can't be just a lexical effect. There's an abstract structural priming effect. Okay. So now we have a tool to study syntactic representations. And then the question is, well, okay, if there are shared representations between languages, we should also find structural priming across languages. And this is exactly what was found in the early years of this century. So roughly around the same time, my lab and Bock's lab showed that indeed there's cross-linguistic structural priming. Loebel and Bock in particular showed it across English and German to English, this is in both directions. There was priming of these dative structures, the DO and the PO datives. Interestingly enough, and this will become important later on, they did not find priming of actives versus passives, neither between English and German, nor within German itself. In a study around the same time, I, together with Pickering and Veldkamp, showed priming of passives and actives between Spanish and English. And a few years later, we looked at these PO and DO datives within Dutch and English. And I just want to show you some of that data, what this looks like. So on the left, you see the study by Hartsuiker et al. 2004, where the participants were primed in Spanish and produced sentences in English. And in addition to the active and passive condition, we also had a baseline condition here, an intransitive, which we hoped would tell us what the base rate of production of passives is. And we had a bit of a funny structure in Spanish, an OVS structure, which puts the object, in this case, the truck, a camion means the truck, first. So it's the truck that chases a taxi, where the taxi is the one doing the chasing. And as you can see in this particular experiment, there was a clear cross-linguistic structural priming effect, to the extent that passives were more likely giving a passive prime than giving an active prime, or giving a baseline prime. This funny OVS was in between, and we can discuss that finding later. On the right, you see the data from Schoonbaert et al. So remember, these are dative structures, DOs and POs. And what you see on this slide are not percentages of DO or PO responses, but these are priming effects. So if we take this slide as an example, the priming effect would be the difference between these two bars. And now you see that difference for 8 conditions, namely 8 directions, 4 directions of priming within the second language, within the first language, from L1 to L2 and from L2 to L1, for conditions with lexical overlap. That's the bigger bars you see, and with different verbs. That's the smaller orange bars. So basically there was priming in all directions, as you can see, which was roughly similar for all of those directions when the verbs were different. But when the verb was identical, you can see this lexical boost here. Okay. So, and these were just 3 experiments I now discussed. Since then, many experiments confirmed the existence of cross-linguistic priming. And what I'm showing you on this slide over here is basically a model that allows us to account for this. A bilingual lexicalist model of lexical syntactic representation, which is inspired by Leveld's model of the lemma stratum in language production, and Pickering and Brannigan's extension of that to include combinatorial nodes. So we have a conceptual level where we have concepts for show and give, for instance. We have a lexical level where we have lemmas for verbs like to show and to give, and where we have syntactic nodes, for instance, for word category, verb, and for combinations. So the verb to show can be combined with a prepositional object and also with a double object. And the same is true for give, and that's the same node, so they're both connected to this combinatorial node. And the bilingual extension is simply that we add, in this case for Dutch, further lemmas marked with a language tag represented here by a flag, which are crucially connected to the same nodes, so to the PO and the DO. So they share their representation of the PO and the DO. That's the idea. Now, on the slide, you now see something that's important. So we assume that nodes are shared across languages when the structures are similar enough. But at this point, I think you should all sort of raise the question, but hold on, when precisely are structures similar enough to be shared, right? Is the PO construction in Dutch and in English exactly the same? Is there a difference between them, and how different can these structures be in order for them to still have a shared representation? Okay. And well, this is something we should have a think about. In fact, it's the case that the constructions we've seen so far are in fact not fully similar. For instance, we looked at transitives in Spanish, but Spanish is somewhat different from English in the sense that it uses a preposition, namely a, when the object is animate. So as you can see in this example, el gato persigue al perro, a contraction of al, a little preposition, which you wouldn't have here when the cat was chasing a truck, for instance. That's different from English, which doesn't have a preposition. Nevertheless, we see cross-linguistic priming. If we look at genitives in Dutch and English, which you see below, so you have something like the hat of the nun versus the nun's hat, then these are somewhat different between Dutch and English. So the hat of the nun, well, there Dutch has almost the same structure, the hoed van de non. But in the second type of genitive, Dutch differs in the sense that you have this personal pronoun, which is gender marked, and which is a freestanding morpheme, not a bound morpheme, and which is also pragmatically a little bit different from English. So you can say the queen's hat in English, but the koningin haar hoed in Dutch is odd because it's more of a structure you would use in informal speech. So apparently, but nevertheless, Bernard et al. Showed priming between these structures. So what does that mean? That means that these representations abstract to some extent over differences. But how different can structures be? Well, let's begin with what I will show to you is a false trail. One attractive avenue might be to think that word order is a crucial factor here. You might remember from just now that Loebel and Bock did not observe priming between English and German transitives. And one reason could be that this is because of the word order difference between German and English passives. So in English, you say the concept is attended by many people, a biphrase final construction. In German, you would say das Konzert wurde von vielen Leuten besucht, where you have a verb final construction. A word order difference and no priming. So perhaps, this sounds intuitively plausible, right? What could be more intrinsic to a syntactic representation than word order. So perhaps the word order needs to be the same before you can get cross-linguistic priming. And indeed, a study by Bernoulli et al. That we did a number of years ago seemed to confirm that word order hypothesis. So we have a nice green sheep here. In English, Dutch, and German, you can all describe this green sheep in two ways, with an adjective noun construction, a pre-modified noun phrase. So the green sheep, het groene schaap or das grüne Schaf. And in all three languages, you can also have a post-modified NP where you have a relative clause after the noun. The sheep that is green, or the equivalents. Het schaap dat groen is en das schaap dat groen is in Dutch and German respectively. And as you notice, a key difference between Dutch and German on the one hand and English on the other hand is that Dutch and German have a verb final order here. And in English, you put the adjective at the end. So Bernoulli et al. Did a priming study in which he primed this structure within English and Dutch and between languages. And I will show you on the next slide what happens here. So let's begin with the Dutch condition. So is there priming at all of this alternation between pre and post-modified NPs? And the answer is yes. There's a clear priming effect. So this is the proportion of relative clause responses, which is way higher in the relative clause prime condition than in the adjective noun prime condition. And what happens if we go to L2, English? I should mention these are Dutch, English, German trilinguals. So in the L2 English, we see clearly the priming effect again. Now, in a real life situation, I would now ask people to raise their hands when they think we replicate this finding as well in the English and Dutch conditions. I would ask, who of you thinks that we will get priming between English and Dutch, and who thinks there will be no priming? Unfortunately, we can't do this little class exercise now, so just do it in your own mind. What do you predict? Will there be priming between English and Dutch, despite the difference in word order? The answer is no. No priming whatsoever. Just, very tiny proportion of RC responses. In this case, people just go for the adjective noun order in all of the cases. And if you go to the reverse direction, the same is true. There's a few RC responses, but this is simply not statistically significant. There's no priming across languages. And is that because it's across languages, or is it because of the word order difference? Could again do a little exercise. What do you think? Well, if you go from Dutch to German, which remember have the same word order in the RC, this is what we get. The priming returns quite nicely. So to sum up, is word order, does it need to be identical in order to get cross-linguistic priming? Well, these data seem to suggest this is the case. Leubel and Bock found no priming between the passives in German and English, which have a different word order. Bernoulli et al. Found no priming between Dutch and English, N and RC structures that have a different word order, but they did find priming for Dutch and German N and RC structures that have the same word order. So one interpretation might be that structures are only shared across languages when word order is identical. And this is a claim that you often find in the literature. But as I'll show you now, that claim is not right. This is a false trail. And I will demonstrate this by showing you 5 counterexamples. The first counterexample, and in all of these 5 counterexamples, I will show you that there is priming despite a difference in word order. Okay, so our first counterexample is priming between English and Dutch passives. And just to remind you, in English, the by phrase is at the end of the passive. We have such prepositional phrase final passive, or PFP, in Dutch as well. Door de bliksem, that's the by phrase. And in Dutch, we also have the prepositional phrase medial passive, where we move the by phrase before the verb. Okay. With movement, I just mean how the sentence is structured. This does not imply any movement in the generativist sense, I should say. And look at the priming effects that Bernard et al. Found when priming from Dutch to English. So basically in Dutch, there are three possibilities. There's actives, the PFPs, and the PMPs. In English, of course, you can only have actives and passives. And on the slide, you see the distribution of active responses, the white bars, and the PFP passive responses, which are the gray bars. So given an active prime, there's loads of actives, and only few passives. Given a PFP, same word as in English, we find way fewer active responses and many PFP passives in the English productions. If we present a PMP, the same is true. There are much fewer actives as compared to the active condition, and there are many PFP responses, which, however, have the different word order, right, from the passive in English. So here, if we compare the first and the third bar here, we see that there's clearly a structural priming across languages, despite this difference in word order. I should note that if you compare the two passive conditions, you can also see a small but clear difference between them. And that difference is statistically reliable. Okay, so even though there is this cross-structure priming, it's somewhat weaker than when the structure is fully identical as the same word order. Okay, so there's priming across word orders after all. And this is counterexample 1. Counterexample 2 is an fMRI study that looked at passives between German and English. And this is just to remind you that, as you now know, I mean, the by phrase in English is final. In German, the only option is to have the verb final and the by phrase medial. So the word order differs between these languages. What these authors did, Weber and Indefry, is using an fMRI repetition suppression design. What it means is that participants in the scanner are exposed to stimuli, and if stimuli have something in common, if stimuli that follow each other in time have something in common, then there's often the finding that certain areas of the brain start to become less activated. So the activation becomes suppressed if there's something similar between subsequent stimuli. For instance, I can present a picture of a house or another building, and I let this follow by another building. It doesn't have to be a house, it could be, I don't know, an apartment block or something, and then a shop. And with every new item from this category of buildings, the activation decreases. If I then present an animal, for instance, activation goes up again, but with every new animal, activation goes down again. That's repetition suppression. And you can do this as well with sentences. If sentences have something in common, let's say a prime and a target sentence that follow each other, then you'd expect the brain activation to go down with the second stimulus. And so this is what they did. They presented passive sentences or neutral sentences, either in German first and then in English, or first in English and then in English. So they compared between language priming and within language priming. And the comparison here was between passive sentences as a prime and target, and a neutral sentence as a prime and a passive as a target. And what you can see in this figure of the brain is the activation level in 3 areas that are part of the language network in the brain. And what you should look at in these graphs is the contrast between the conditions ending with P and the conditions ending with U. So the U, this is the baseline condition where you have a neutral stimulus, and P is the case where we have 2 passives in a row. And you can see that in all of these comparisons, the bar with the passive, with 2 passives in a row, is lower than the bar with the neutral stimulus, meaning that there's suppression of activation when you repeat the passive. In other words, the brain picks up on the similarity between the passive in English and the passive in German, despite the difference in word order. Okay, at this point you might be getting a bit tired of passives, and in particular the set of languages we always look at, namely German and Dutch and English. But the next example shows you that this is not just something that's specific to Germanic languages. A study by Wang et al. In language learning from a few years ago showed priming across Korean and English, even though Korean and English differ in the basic word order. So whereas English is an SVO language, Korean is an SOV language. So the policeman chased a thief would be something like policeman, nominative, thief, accusative, chased. And whereas the passive in English would have order SVO, a thief is chased by policeman. It is thief nominative, policeman dative was chased. So is it the case that if we have a prime in Korean of structure SOV, an active or a passive, whether this primes passives in English? And the answer is yes, it does, despite
I think we have a technical problem, so we hope to get back to you very soon with our plenary talk and the continuation of the lecture. So please give us just a few seconds, okay, to figure that out.
the Korean one. So let's just move on to the next slide, which is the study across Dutch and an artificial language. Where we taught our participants a language that, was completely made up by us, where we gave people a lexicon consisting of actors, objects, and verbs, and which we taught them by means of pictures and action movies. So I can show you, I hope this works, an example of such a movie. So they would see a clip like this, and they would learn that you can describe this in our artificial language with something like Heskon vijp raptis, for instance, or raptis vijp ka Heskon, which would be a passive sentence. Okay, so what did we do in this case? People learned an artificial language that either had the structure SVO or the structure SOV. And you can see some examples in the green frame here. So we had something like that is Swiftsy Fuipam or passive equivalence, which is an SVO structure. And the SOV variant, we just switched around the order of the object and the verb. So they learned something like clown, cook, kisses. These were two different groups, each learning a different language. One group learned the SVO language, the other group learned the SOV language. And it's quite an interesting project. So each session consisted of vocabulary learning, of a sentence exposure phase, where they saw a clip and then heard a sentence, a matching phase, where they matched sentences to two alternative clips, a production training, where they saw a clip, described it, and then got feedback, and then a structural priming block, which to them was just another set of these learning blocks, but now an intertwinement of a matching task, which happened on the prime sentence, and a production task, which happens for the targets. Now, if we look at the results here, these are when the priming was between Dutch and the artificial language, and the artificial language as a target, so the PPO2 targets, and on the right you see the Dutch targets as a function of whether the verbs are related or unrelated, and whether the prime language was artificial language or the Dutch language. So most important here is the condition across languages, so between Dutch and PPO2, and between PPO2 and Dutch. And what you should focus on here are the red bars and the blue bars. That's the SVO condition and the SOV condition, respectively. So what this shows in particular is that there was a priming effect of comparable magnitude between the artificial language with SOV order and Dutch as compared to SVO order and Dutch, even though Dutch has SVO word order for these particular types of sentences. So equivalent priming, despite a major difference in the word order. So is it the case that word order needs to be identical for cross-linguistic priming to occur? No. There are at least 5 studies showing cross-language priming despite word order differences. And I think there are, in fact, a few more. So why then didn't Löbel and Bock find priming for transitives? Well, one possibility is that this was simply a power issue. Remember that in their experiment, they also found no priming for actives and passives within German. And of course, within German, you have this one and the same representation for passives. And why didn't Bernard et al. Then find priming for these across these post-modified MPs? Well, one hypothesis we have is that this is because syntactic sharing can be preempted. And this is the preemption or blocking hypothesis from the title by competing constructions. So what do I mean with this? So just to remind you, Dutch and German have an N plus RC structure that's verb final. The sheep that green is, literally. In principle, one could imagine a model like the one you see over here, where we have lemmas for the 3 languages, where we have syntactic structures for the pre-nominal modification and the post-nominal, where the N plus RC would be somewhat abstract across languages, and where then the language-specific rules would work out the details of the RC, whether it's verb final or adjective final. So this would be a possible model. However, I would argue that this is not the case because Dutch is more complicated then one would think it needs to keep apart word order variations in the relative clause beyond just an adjective and a verb. For instance, if we have an auxiliary and participle construction, the sheep that is sheared, or the sheep that sheared is, then Dutch allows both of these word orders. That means Dutch needs to make representations to keep apart these word orders. And I would argue that if you need to keep apart those word orders, then you can't simply collapse them despite a difference. Okay, just looking at the time and see that I need to hurry a little bit. Okay, so this is what Dutch needs to do. It needs to build up all these structures, and because of this, it can't simply collapse everything into one n plus RC node. Another example of this preemption idea is something we would get with SOV and SVO word orders. So our preemption hypothesis predicts that you shouldn't find priming across word orders if you have a language with both SOV and SOV versions of actives and passives. So if you just have only SOV, you might collapse them, the active and the passive, with SVO, active and passive in another language. But if you need to keep apart the SOV and SVO word order, as in this example over here, you can't collapse them. You have separate representations for these items. Now, this is something we showed in this study over here, where we primed between PPO2 and Dutch. But now in a version of PPO2 that had both SVO passives and SOV passives. What you can see over here is that, especially in the cross-linguistic conditions, there was much stronger priming for the SVO conditions than for the SOV conditions. So apparently the fact that SVO already exists blocks, to a certain extent, the sharing of SOV with the Dutch SVO representation. Okay, and I just want to really quickly go to a third example of preemption, which is something we found in a translation paradigm. So this is a study by Meyer and colleagues from a few years ago, where our assumption is that translation is regeneration from a message. So people are not going just word by word. So you build up the message and then you produce the sentence, and this sentence production driven by the message is subject to lexical and structural priming. And what we did here is we worked with dative structures in German and in English. So both German and English have a double object dative that has the order dative accusative. The little boy wrote the neighbor the letter. But German also has a scrambled order with accusative dative order, as you can see over here. Whereas English has the PO, the little boy wrote a letter to the neighbor. And I should mention German has a PO as well, at least for a number of verbs. So what we did over here is do priming from German to English in groups that had German or English as the first language. So German-English bilinguals and English-German bilinguals. What you can see here is that if we go from the DO act that structure in German to English, people tend to translate it as a prepositional object response, despite, let's say, this difference in structure, in word order. But this happened a lot more in people with English as their L1 as compared to the participants with German as their L1. And why would this be the case? I would argue this is preemption again. So if you are a native speaker of German, you have solid representations of all three German structures. So you have separate nodes for the PO, which you occasionally use, and the DO, ac, dat structure. And so given an ac, dat sentence in German, you're not particularly likely to translate it as a PO in English. But if you have English as your L1, you have solid representations only of the PO and the DO ac, dat in English. You share them with German, but you don't have a good representation of this highly infrequent structure. And so when confronted with that structure, I would argue you merge it with the PO, which you know from English. And so given a DO ac, dat in German, you translate it as a PO into English. Okay, so in sum, syntactic structures can be shared across languages, despite differences in morphology, pragmatics, and even word order, but only if there's room, let's say, in representational space, if you want, to allow this. And if there are other alternations present that take up this space, then you can't share these languages. And we've seen 3 examples of it. And to put it a little bit more formally, if we have structure X in language A and X bar in language B, these can be shared or collapsed across each other only if neither language allows both X and X bar. So in this case, where X is specific to language A and X bar to language B, we can collapse it and share the representation. But if language A has both of these structures and language B only X bar, then we can't collapse it, right? Because language A needs to make the distinction between X and X bar. Okay, and I just want to really quickly end with a few points for discussion. So this preemption hypothesis doesn't completely come out of the blue. If you work on bilingualism in children, for instance, you might see that this has similarities with some accounts of cross-language influence in that field, a particular hypothesis by Hulk and Muller from a few years ago. And it's also somewhat similar to the notion of preemption in construction grammar. Think of work by Goldberg and colleagues. But also, there is a link with learning theory. So there's the phenomenon of blocking. I don't have time to go into it now, in classic conditioning, which also means that, if an existing association is there already, it becomes more difficult to make a new one. The preemption account, of course, needs further testing. One prediction I would make, this is perhaps risky, but I would predict that if you tested between German and English, you would get priming between pre and post modified NPs, because as opposed to Dutch, German has a fixed order in the relative clause that's verb final. So the example you see here is a non-verb final one that's ungrammatical. Third, I am aware of the fact that, of course, in some varieties of German, some weird orders are possible, such as PP final passives. So the model may not apply to everyone. It depends on the repertoire of structures you have in your version of the language. And another factor that's interesting and important is explicit learning. So for instance, we looked at students in Belgium who have French as their L1 and Dutch as their L2 who learn Dutch. And we thought that they would prefer the PP final passive in Dutch because that's the same structure they also have in French. And that's the only structure they have in French. But in fact, they strongly prefer the PP medial passive in Dutch. And trying to figure out what was going on there, we discovered this is because of explicit instruction. This is what they get taught in school. Use verb final constructions in Dutch. It's a verb final language. And so the L2 system is not just shaped by exposure and implicit learning processes, as the one I discussed today. Explicit learning also shapes this system. Finally, I've always almost equated priming and shared representations. You might see this as a shorthand, because one might argue similar representations might not be shared, but simply connected to each other, activating each other. And that's something that's notoriously difficult to test empirically. There's in fact some discussion on whether priming within languages is stronger than between languages. If they're merely connected, you might argue that priming within a language should be stronger than between language. If they're fully shared, you would say both priming effects are of the same magnitude. I have found some evidence that the degree of priming is similar between and across languages, but that's affirming the null hypothesis, and that's of course always somewhat tricky. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk, and I look forward to hearing your questions. So let me also thank the people I worked with, in particular Merel Muilen, who did the artificial language work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for this very interesting and informative talk. And we now have 10 minutes for short discussion. So if you have any questions, please either raise your hand or write them in the chat here, and I will read them out.
Should I stop sharing my screen, or should I leave it on?
Yeah, you can stop sharing it. I think it would be easier. Thank you.
Okay. Ooh,